we have to understand where the war came from and therefore how it can end. The war started with the continuation of the Cold War after 1991. People thought there was peace, but the CIA, the military-industrial complex, continued the effort to weaken Russia. Brzezinski talked about Russia falling into three pieces in a 1997 article, saying that maybe there'll be a loose confederation of a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, a Far East Russia. But the U.S. design was that Russia should finally basically be crushed, that the Cold War was with the Soviet Union, but we're not over yet. We're dominant. We won. And on that basis, Clinton began NATO enlargement. I say Clinton because basically every president then did the bidding of the military-industrial complex. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump won, Biden. And maybe this is going to end this crazy misadventure, but this has been 30 years of trying to push NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia, by the way, in the South Caucasus, where the U.S. meddling continues to this day. The idea is Russia's a big country, and therefore it should be a weak country, according to the U.S. Strategic doctrine. Okay, we overthrew a government in February 2014, installed a pro-NATO regime. Russia immediately took back Crimea at that moment because the post-coup government in Ukraine said, okay, we want Russia out of its Black Fleet naval base in Crimea. That's a naval base that Catherine the Great established in 1783 and that has been core to Russia's national security and power since 1783. The United States and let's say the deep state said, we want Russia out of there. That was the same idea of the British and the French in 1853 of trying to get Russia out of Crimea in the Crimean War. Okay, enough history. The basic point is Russia does not want to be surrounded. It does not want NATO present. It does not want security guarantees like Article 5. It does not want Western troops on the ground. It wants Ukraine, at a minimum, to be a neutral buffer zone between the United States and its proxies and allies and Russia. That's the bottom line. So, starting point, no NATO. Similarly, nothing that's NATO-like or NATO-light of French and British troops and German troops, and that's what the whole war has been about. Right. Second, Crimea is never going back. This is absolutely clear. This was a gambit. This was a ploy of NATO to grab Crimea, and the whole idea, which Brzezinski spelled out in 1997, was if we can basically get Ukraine and push Russia out of the Black Sea, then Russia has no power in the Middle East. It has no power in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that was part of the strategy. So Crimea staying. Then come the territories that Russia has annexed as of November 2022. This is 2 in the east and 2 in the south. The idea of this goes back to 2 points. One is that at least in the east, these are overwhelmingly ethnically Russian regions, the Donbass. And Russia said in 2015, make them autonomous. We don't want them as territory, but make them autonomous under a treaty called the Minsk II Agreement. The United States, typically, because it was still in its expansionist mode, said no, told Ukraine, you don't have to honor that agreement. Russia did not claim those territories. It just said, leave them alone to have the Russian language, Russian ethnicity, and so forth. And Ukraine, in the post-coup environment, said, no, we will take them in a unitary state. So Russia grabbed those back. Now it's claimed those back because the Minsk II agreement failed.
The reason why I think the map is quite important, sir, is if you look at the red areas, this is, I guess, this is, I mean, probably as accurate as it gets. This is the United States, intelligence community creating this map for the president in the Oval Office, which he used. And as you were talking, you can actually see the percentage numbers that have been listed here by the U.S. intelligence community. If we zoom in, we can see some 70 to 80 to 90% of many of these provinces, like you were these areas, like you were talking about, and they're controlled by Russia. So you can just, as you can see from that map, it backs up much of what you're saying.
So the basic idea is that, ironically, before the United States made the coup in February 2014, Russia was not claiming these territories at all. Not at all. We blew it for Ukraine because this is so typical of the CIA, by the way. We lose for our supposed friends. So when the coup came and Kiev, that is the new central government in the post-coup Ukraine, said we'll crack down on the ethnic Russian regions in the east and the south, a treaty was brokered by Russia to stop what was then a beginning war, called the Minsk I and then the Minsk II agreements. And the idea was that those regions, especially the two in the east, Lugansk and Donetsk, would be autonomous. Interestingly, by the way, just a little footnote, the model of that was a European model. In Italy, there is a German-speaking region called South Tyrol, which has autonomy within Italy. Actually, Chancellor Merkel, who was then the German chancellor, knew about that and said that the Minsk II agreement can be modeled like South Tyrol. In other words, an autonomous region in Italy, but of German speakers, but very peaceful, very successful, very beautiful, wonderful skiing and tourism, by the way. And they said that could be the solution. The United States wasn't having it. And the extremist nationalists in Ukraine were not having it. They said, no autonomy, unitary state. And they blew the chance to keep those provinces because after Russia's invasion, they control almost all of it now. That's what the shaded areas of the map are. The battle line control, the battlefield control that Russia has over these areas. Now, where does that bring us till today? Ukraine cannot win back those territories other than through a massive war, which could, again, be a massive failure, massive deaths, a massive escalation to nuclear war. So it can't really win those back. Ukraine has said every day, we'll never give up a square meter of our territory. Impossible. This is all ours. The European leaders who were there yesterday have parroted that line. Well, what's the alternative? The alternative then is the fighting continues. If the fighting continues as it's continuing now, Russia will simply take those regions physically. It will proceed to take more territory, by the way, of Ukraine. And eventually, I think on the current scenario, Ukraine would simply be conquered. The hardline warmongers, and Merz is a true warmonger. He is really disgusting, in my view, by the way. Awful chancellor. Just unbelievable. Every word he says is more war. Basically, they say, sure, let's escalate. We won't give up an inch. Well, this already has been the last 11 years. I don't think Trump wants that. I don't think his MAGA base wants that. I don't think the American people want that. The Ukrainian people don't want that. The most recent Gallup survey in Ukraine said, stop this war. We're exhausted. More than 1 million Ukrainians have died. So all of this is to say that no NATO, a neutral Ukraine, Crimea is ours, and these 4 territories are contested. What is likely to happen is some de facto recognition that Russia controls these, that there will be a permanent peace. maybe Ukraine in the end.
All of the issue of the Ukraine war comes down to a basic reciprocity, or the golden rule. We should not do in other places what we would not have others do to us in our own neighborhood. We have had the so-called Monroe Doctrine for 202 years. The Monroe Doctrine was issued in 1823 by President Monroe, written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. It said to the Europeans, don't meddle in our neighborhood, and we won't meddle in yours. Very important, that second clause, very often forgotten. As the United States became its own imperial power, it was more do as we say, not as we do. In other words, don't come close to us, but we will meddle wherever we want in your neighborhood. And of course, the war in Ukraine, I say of course, because anyone who knows the background knows that it is of course, though the narrative or propaganda of the US government is the opposite. But of course, the war in Ukraine came because the US was meddling right against Russia's border, meddling in a most direct security sense, which is to push NATO and US missile systems into Ukraine, and not only into Ukraine, into the South Caucasus region as well. People should look at a map and look at the absurdity, worse than absurdity, the tragic arrogance of the US saying that the country Georgia should also be part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, the idea was the opposite of what we would ever tolerate in our own region. That is, the United States wanted to surround Russia in the Black Sea region, forming literally pincers of Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia to surround Russia where its Black Sea naval fleet is. It's out of a playbook from the 19th century, believe it or not. It's the playbook of the British and French empires in 1853 when they launched a war against Russia called the Crimean War. Well, all of this is to say that Russia said, no, don't do that. It said that in the 1990s. It said, really, don't do that. In 2007, President Putin said, don't you dare do that. In 2008, the United States, being the arrogant U.S. that it is, said, of course we'll do it. Who are you? You're a third-rate power. We can do whatever we want. And pushed our vassal states, otherwise known as the European countries, to support the U.S.-led expansion of NATO to Ukraine and Georgia at the 2008 Bucharest summit. As we've discussed many times, there was one little fly in the ointment, and that is the Ukrainians didn't want to be drawn into this proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. So the Ukrainians voted for a president who said, we'll be neutral. That was President Yanukovych. Well, the U.S. hates neutrality. And so the U.S. overthrew Yanukovych in February 2014, and the rah-rah, yes, we'll be part of NATO regime came in, including Zelensky to this day. Anyway, the whole upshot of it is the Russians are not tolerating, understandably, the U.S. and Europe having military presence on their border in Ukraine. And anyone who says, and this is the mantra of the people who don't think very clearly in the U.S., oh, Ukraine has any right to choose what it wants. It's not about Ukraine choosing. It's about if Russia invites China to have a military base in Mexico, if Mexico chooses that, are these people going to say, yeah, that's Mexico's choice. We're fine with the Chinese military base in Mexico on our border? Of course, the United States would not tolerate that. So this is the point. And this is clear. It's understood by everyone that has looked closely at this. It was understood by U.S. diplomats going back to the 1990s who told the CIA and the politicians, stop, this is crazy. You're going to get us into deep trouble. George Kennan, who was the greatest Russia expert of the age, a great statesman, said in 1997, this is the biggest conceivable blunder that we're making to expand NATO. This is going to ruin everything. What should be peace is going to be turned into a new confrontation. Bill Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, said to Clinton, you'll ruin everything. And Perry thought about resigning in protest because the decisions to expand NATO were so stupid and so reckless. Anyway, here we are, Judge, all this time later, except with 1 million Ukrainian dead because of this little U.S. adventure.
So we know that he must have said this, President Trump must have given the unmistakable impression to Prime Minister Starmer, Chancellor Merz, and President Macron that the United States would participate in militarily in security guarantees. I'm doing air quotes because nobody can really define what that means to the satisfaction of everybody else. He must have known that Putin and Lavrov would never accept EU, UK, US troops on the ground or in the air. And then the president said to Fox News the next day, well, I didn't mean boots on the ground. I meant boots in the air. He didn't say boots in the air, but reference to American pilots in the air. They're not going to accept that. Doesn't Donald Trump know that? Or is he telling the kabuki dancers who visited him in the Oval Office, who he treated like children, another story for another time, what he thinks they want to hear?
Everything is deliberately vague, opaque, smiles. This is why the war didn't end in 24 hours as Trump said that it would, because if there were clarity and honesty, the war could have ended in 24 hours. The President of the United States should say clearly, NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. There will not be NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. Ukraine's security is not going to come through NATO. It's going to come through Ukraine's neutrality, which all sides are going to respect because it's going to be very visible. And any violation of that will be understood by the whole world. And so that's where the security is going to come from. If the president knew some history or had any advisors who knew some history, they would know that the neutrality approach has actually worked repeatedly and dramatically well. The most famous example is Austria becoming neutral in 1955 with an agreement with the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union would withdraw its troops from Austria on the basis of Austria's neutrality. That happened, and the Soviet troops went home and never bothered Austria again. That's also the truth. Unfortunately, we don't have a president who speaks other than by Truth Social posts that change by the moment. Nobody explains anything. Nobody's willing to say clearly almost anything. Everything has ambiguity to it deliberately. They think this is somehow clever. All it means is the war goes on and on and on. And one of the reasons is that the United States was playing a game. Of course, Ukraine in NATO is not core to U.S. security. So what was the U.S. doing pushing this? It was pushing NATO enlargement as a game to weaken Russia.
Right.
Brzezinski spelled it out. People have to read. But of course, the whole public narrative of the US government is to keep people away from basic facts. But the whole game that the US would play was spelled out by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997. And the game was to weaken Russia. And it was a game because it's not core to US security. In fact, it's created US insecurity by bringing the United States into a war with Russia. Now, Trump somehow, gets this, or people around him kind of get this, but nobody explains it clearly. Nobody. And so everything is, like you say, kabuki theater of what do these words mean? Yes. And Trump, we love you, and we love you, and we love you, and everything is ambiguous. And the result is the war goes on day by day.
Before we get to Netanyahu's latest monstrosities, I want to prevail upon your other field of expertise, which is international economics. Was Vladimir Putin in Alaska, in a certain sense, there representing BRICS?
Well, in the following strange way, President Trump has united the BRICS countries. The BRICS countries are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a number of new members, but the 5 that I mentioned are the original BRICS countries. President Trump has united them because he has gone after every one of them to a shocking extent. And in the lead up to the Alaska summit, Trump destroyed years of developing closer relations with India, destroyed it almost overnight by putting a so-called security tariff against India, a 25% tariff, because India buys oil from Russia as Europe buys natural gas from Russia, as the United States buys many things from Russia, but they decided to go after India. That pushed India away from the United States. I can only tell you in shorthand the reactions in India, which I follow very, very closely, are to have united a country of 1.5 billion people to say the United States is completely untrustworthy. Completely. It united the whole country. Wow. Same with Brazil, by the way. He penalized Brazil. Why? Because there is a court case in Brazil against the previous president, Bolsonaro. And President Trump said, I'm going to punish Brazil because of a court case in Brazil. Well, President Lula, the duly elected president of Brazil, said, excuse me, we don't need an emperor. We have an independent judiciary. So Trump has put on tariffs against Brazil. And basically what he did was say to all of these large countries, the U.S. is your enemy. And we are untrustworthy because we will punish you as we want. And then the big guns of the administration, Peter Navarro, the advisor to the president, and Secretary of Treasury Bessent, have gone on a campaign of insulting India every day. It's shockingly stupid, unbelievable. From America's point of view, what do they think they are doing? Well, what they're doing is there has been a flurry of diplomacy of Brazil, Russia, India, China, meeting each other nonstop in phone calls, visits by foreign ministers, visits by heads of state, calls of heads of state, meetings coming up of Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping.
Nobody speaks in a straightforward way. Maybe that's to be expected, but it's it also is why we're at war endlessly, because there's dishonesty everywhere. There was no straightforward discussion. What are the alternatives? Mertz, he hasn't said one thing that I've agreed with since he became chancellor. And I would say that that's basically true of the German people also, because Mertz's popularity is in a free fall, or his approval rating, let's say, is in a free fall. It's down to around 30%. He came in with the majority support, as you do when you've won an election, and it's in free fall because he doesn't make any sense. Russia will not agree to a ceasefire without a solution to the issues that we've been discussing. That's been Russia's position, understandably, by the way, in my opinion, from the start. Well, we are at war for reasons. Von Clausewitz, the German war theorist of the 19th century, famously said that war is a continuation of politics with other means. And so this is a very important observation. This is a war about politics. It's a war about NATO. It's a war about U.S.-Russia relations. It's a war about the U.S. overthrowing governments with impunity. By the way, it seems to be a rule that once you've overthrown a few governments, you retire to Columbia University as my colleague, because we have Victoria Nuland, we have Hillary Clinton, we have Mike Pompeo. I don't know. And they teach diplomacy. This is unbelievable to me. But this is part of what this war is about, which is that the U.S. acted with impunity after 1991 and told us that they would. The Project for a New American Century said, hey, we're not only the big kid on the block, we're the only kid on the block. We're the sole superpower. We are the world's policeman. We are the world's hegemon. We do what we want. That's what this war was about originally. Now, Trump, I think, probably understands that the American people are just sick of this, by the way. It's endless wars. It's not only this war, it's the wars throughout the Middle East that Israel wangles us into, absolutely destructive and vile wars. And the American people are sick of it. Nobody speaks straightforwardly. Trump doesn't explain after Alaska or after yesterday anything. There's no speech from the Oval Office. There's no explanation. We're in a different time from the time that I used to remember. Not that things were perfect, but if President Kennedy wanted to achieve a treaty with the Soviet Union, he'd give a speech, and then people would analyze the speech and understand it and so forth. Now we have true social posts that are completely ambiguous, mean nothing, and we're trying to parse what the words mean.
And can be reversed the next day, by the way.
Exactly.
You say one thing and say the exact opposite thing the next day when he's with someone else. I wanted to ask you about how Zelensky figures into all of this. Let's say that the vibes between him and Trump were very different this time than the last time Zelensky was in the Oval Office. Let's go ahead, guys, and play A2.
We had very good conversation with President Trump.
Very good.
And it really was the best one. Maybe the best one will be in the future. But it was really good. And we spoke about very sensitive points. The first one is security guarantees. And we are very happy with President that all the leaders are here, and the security in Ukraine depends on the United States and on you and on those leaders who are with us.
And Professor Zucker and I both noted he seems to have really been working on his English. Clearly, he realizes that it's very important he's able to have an effective relationship with President Trump here. But, you said earlier, it seems like the Ukrainian people are exhausted, want to bring this war to a close. It's not clear that their president is on board with that. What do you make of his role and his positioning and what he wants to see going forward?
First, it's important to understand that there is martial law in Ukraine. We watched the videos also of people being forcibly knocked off their bicycles or dragged off the street to the front line to their death. And Zelensky is ruling over a military regime, not a democracy. His democratic term of office expired years ago, and he continues to rule by martial law, basically, by decree. So I don't give any I don't give any legitimacy to his statements as reflecting the will of the Ukrainian people. This is a starting point. I've never really admired what he's done, because rather than signing a peace agreement that he had in front of him in April 2022 that would have ended this war on far better terms than anything that's going to happen now, he let the United States talk him out of that. Maybe he's a mere puppet anyway, but instead of signing an agreement that was on the table on April 15th, 2022 in the so-called Istanbul process, he walked away from a peace agreement, since then has lost massive territory and probably 1 million Ukrainian dead. So I'm no fan, I have to say. I'm no admirer. I'm no believer that this is defending Ukrainian democracy. There is no democracy. And so one of the things that makes the idea that if Zelensky meets with Putin, he's shown to be on the big stage globally, and then he can maintain his power either through winning a re-election, perhaps, or just expanding and extending his military rule. But this seems to be the carrot that Trump is dangling to Zelensky. I'll put you on the big stage. We won't overthrow you. We won't let Putin diss you. You'll have respect, but you have to give in on this, this, and this. So,
right.
Frankly, Zelensky is, look, he's losing a war on the battlefield. He doesn't have the public support. He rules by martial law. By all accounts, which I can't personally verify, but by all accounts, the regime is incredibly corrupt. So not only am I no fan, I think probably what Trump is trying to do is to appeal to the most narrow and basest survival instincts of Zelensky himself, and dangling this meeting with Putin, the big stage summit, as the prize, and then getting Zelensky in one way or another to basically end the rhetoric of fighting on to restore the 1991 borders. I think that first, it's important to understand that there is martial law in Ukraine. We watched the videos also of people being forcibly knocked off their bicycles or dragged off the street to the front line to their death. And Zelensky is ruling over a military regime, not a democracy. His democratic term of office expired years ago, and he continues to rule by martial law, basically by decree. So I don't give any legitimacy to his statements as reflecting the will of the Ukrainian people. This is a starting point. I've never really admired what he's done, because rather than signing a peace agreement that he had in front of him in April 2022 that would have ended this war on far better terms than anything that's going to happen now, he let the United States talk him out of that. Maybe he's a mere puppet anyway, but instead of signing an agreement that was on the table on April 15th, 2022 in the so-called Istanbul process, he walked away from a peace agreement, since then has lost massive territory and probably 1 million Ukrainian dead. So I'm no fan, I have to say. I'm no admirer. I'm no believer that this is defending Ukrainian democracy. There is no democracy. And so one of the things that makes the idea that if Zelensky meets with Putin, he's shown to be on the big stage globally, and then he can maintain his power either through winning a re-election, perhaps, or just expanding and extending his military rule. But this seems to be the carrot that Trump is dangling to Zelensky. I'll put you on the big stage. We won't overthrow you. We won't let Putin diss you. You'll have respect, but you have to give in on this, this, and this. So,
right.
Frankly, Zelensky is, look, he's losing a war on the battlefield. He doesn't have the public support. He rules by martial law. By all accounts, which I can't personally verify, but by all accounts, the regime is incredibly corrupt. So not only am I no fan, I think probably what Trump is trying to do is to appeal to the most narrow and basest survival instincts of Zelensky himself, and dangling this meeting with Putin, the big stage summit, as the prize, and then getting Zelensky in one way or another to basically end the rhetoric of fighting on to restore the 1991 borders. I think that's what's happening.
Last thing we wanted your take on, sir, is some of the continuation, because, the threat from the United States is, well, if this doesn't work, we'll just go to more sanctions, as if Russia is not the most sanctioned country in the world. Already, we've actually seen, we can put A7, please, here on the screen. Both Lindsey Graham and the White House advisor, Peter Navarro, say that India's, quote, Russian crude oil buying must stop. Of course, even the imposition of 50% tariffs on India has not changed their behavior a single iota. In fact, Narendra Modi is posting about phone calls with President Putin just yesterday. I believe I was reading this morning that the Chinese foreign minister is actually in New Delhi as of this morning, meeting with the Indian foreign minister. So they're basically holding up a middle finger to the U.S. in response to these tariffs. So it does appear that many of the cards that are supposedly left to play, both by the Europeans and the U.S., don't really exist if they want to put any more, quote, pressure on Russia.
Lindsey Graham is the worst senator in the U.S. Senate. I just want to be on the record stating that. I will state that every show you have me on. He's a fool, just a fool. Okay, let me put that aside to get onto the substance. The imposition of the 25% penalty tariff on India was the stupidest tactical move of U.S. foreign policy for a long time. And that's saying a lot, by the way. I could make a list of the top 10, the top 20.
I'd like to see that list, Professor.
Yes.
If you make
it. Why don't we talk about that
list
sometime?
Yeah.
But what it did overnight was unify the BRICS countries as never before. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I watched it, by the way, pretty close up, actually, because I know the leaders in all of these countries. Within 24, 48 hours, there was a flurry of calls. Brazil with India, Brazil with Russia, Brazil with China, China with India, China with Russia. Donald Trump was the great unifier of the BRICS. And wonderful. Okay, I like the BRICS, by the way. So I have no problem with that. But the opposite of what Lindsey Graham conceivably could have been thinking, or Peter Navarro, who, okay, I'll put him on the list of probably the most incompetent PhD that my former department ever granted. He is a PhD in economics that apparently learned nothing, certainly didn't take my class. But in any event, going after India, a country that the U.S. has been cultivating for strategic and diplomatic relations, and it's a long story, but trying to get India on side against China and the so-called Quad arrangement and so many things. And Trump ended it overnight because, by the way, even if this 25% tariff penalty is removed, and I think it probably will be, the Indians learned a lesson that I was trying to tell them, by the way, for years. You cannot trust the United States. And no, we've got the inside track. We've got good relations. No, you don't. There's no ability to have a trusting relationship with the United States. This is improv land. And you're not going to get the kind of relationship that you think. Well, everybody in India understands that completely. Not only have the BRICS countries been pulled together, but in the media in India, in the print.
Israel is the most lawless, violent, criminal, rogue state on the planet. It is committing a genocide. It is starving 2 million people. And it is now proposing to do more. Very explicitly, first to occupy Gaza through another major military operation against a population facing starvation, and in the occupied West Bank of Palestine to establish new settlements that explicitly, according to the minister, zealot minister of this government, Smotrich, will destroy any chance for a state of Palestine. In other words, Israel is not only committing a genocide, it is upping the ante right now. It is a rogue state operating completely outside of international law, spitting in the face of the entire world. The American people are overwhelmingly against what Israel is doing, overwhelmingly. And they are calling for the United States to recognize a state of Palestine to save millions of people who are being starved to death or facing expulsion, ethnic cleansing, murder, and expropriation. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but we have not seen anything so shocking as this in our lifetimes, actually, in recent decades. What is happening right now is utter criminality. What is the U.S. doing about it? It is siding with Israel in everything. It is completely complicit in everything. It sanctions the International Criminal Court, which cites these war crimes. It sanctions the judges of the International Criminal Court. President Trump declares that Netanyahu, who presides over these crimes, is a great person and a war hero. And he calls himself a war hero also for his war on Iran. We are seeing something that is beyond imagining taking place before our eyes. And it is two countries doing it, not one. It is the United States and Israel. And how Trump operates in this way and draws the American people against our will into this is a disgrace. He calls himself a peace president. This is a genocide president.
Not to add to your heartburn, but here is Minister Smotrich, who with his colleague Ben-Gvir are really the linchpins of the government, because if they and their colleagues leave the Netanyahu government, then he has to face the Israeli public and likely loss of his position and resumption of prosecutions. Anyway, here's Smotrich 4 days ago. Chris, cut number 14.
The
time has come to fully apply Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, to forever remove from the table the idea of dividing the land, and to make sure that by September, Europe's hypocrite leaders will simply have nothing to recognize.
This is literally
notorious and bold about what they're doing. They recognize no standards, no humanitarian constraints on their behavior whatsoever.
No international law, no international community, no respect for the decent opinions of mankind, as Thomas Jefferson said. Just mass murder, by the way. Mass murder. And so, and the United States is a full party to this.
I was particularly upset when I heard President Trump refer to Prime Minister Netanyahu as a war hero.
He's a war criminal, and
he's absolutely a war criminal.
He's under arraignment by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, for war crimes, and his country is at the Hague in the International Court of Justice, facing charges brought by numerous countries for the crime of genocide. And the United States is every hour, every day, a party, not only a party to this, it is a partner in this.
I have to run, Professor Sachs. I didn't mean to ruin your morning, but thank you very much. You needn't apologize for being blunt. The Israeli behavior calls for blunt speech, whether people are listening or not. A lot of people are listening, not Trump and his cohorts, and not the people that run the Israeli government, but the world is listening to
And
you.
by the way, if American politicians, the ones that aren't so corrupted or blackmailed, would open their eyes, they would see the American people are disgusted by the behavior of the Congress. Standing ovations for this war criminal. Look at the Reuters poll just a few days ago. We are disgusted by the behavior of Washington. It's Trump, it's the Congress in the hands of this lobby that is